At WI, we are a rich and diverse community from locations all around the world, as you can see here today. And we welcome and respect all backgrounds, all cultures, all beliefs. And we really do aim to create a space here where everyone feels they are able to share, everybody is included, everybody is welcome. We can't say it enough. So please feel comfortable and feel free to bring your thoughts and your questions to the conversation here. And always feel free to use the chat. And without further ado, I would love to hand it over to our Executive Director, Athena Casares.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's so great to have you all here. And as Amber said, if you can put your video on, we always love to see everyone's faces. So welcome to our very first Empower Hour. And this concept was born out of really requests from our community to hear more from both our coaches and our catalysts. So the way we thought of this topic was by looking at really hundreds of applications as well as hearing from our catalysts about what are some of the topics that they're most concerned about, what are the topics that they want coaching on, what are the topics they want to be in conversation about. And one of the very top ones was about how do I show up in a way that is true to me, true to my authentic leadership. And we are so fortunate today to have Aqua, who is joining us from Ghana, and Whitney, who's joining us from Tulsa, to help us dive deep into this conversation. So I'm going to do a very brief intro because I want most of the time to be spent with them in conversation and with all of you in conversation with each other. So Aqua is an amazing certified executive and leadership coach, and she volunteers for WIA and has been for a number of years volunteering with us. She's also the host of an amazing podcast called Open Door Conversations, and her mission is to help entrepreneurial-minded leaders to move from juggling too many balls, which we all know how that is, to knowing exactly what to focus their attention on and how to prioritize their energy. So a very important focus for Aqua. And Whitney, who is a WIA graduate and really just such a shining light in the social impact world, she is a social entrepreneur. She founded her own organization called Illustra Impact to support leaders who are in developing the skills and strategies and systems that really foster social impact. So we have two amazing women together in conversation, and they're going to be sharing, each of them will share their own wisdom and ideas about this concept and this kind of effort that we all make to be authentic in our leadership. And there's also going to be some time for all of you to speak together in breakout rooms and also time for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Aqua and Whitney.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's good to be with you all. We are excited to begin this conversation, and I know many of you are attracted to the topic of today. So I just want to open by inviting Aqua to share with us, how do you define authentic leadership presence?
Yeah, I think it's such a really, really great question. And I think I want to start with how I normally start when I meet new people or when I'm introducing myself. I typically do that by first and foremost spelling out my name. So it's Akua. I then normally will share that my father is from Ghana and that he calls me Ikuya. My mom is from the US. She calls me Akua. And I grew up mostly in Francophone West Africa and North Africa, and they typically refer to me as Aqua. And then I'm not picky about it. It's really important for me to share that because for some people, my name, right, is something they maybe have never seen and don't know how to engage with. And for me, it's really authentic to be able to share that I have this diverse background and that I'm actually not that picky about how my name is actually pronounced. To me, that's authentic. For somebody else, they might have a particular way in which they want their name to be pronounced, and that's something that's so very important to them. So for me, being authentic is understanding your values and really being able to share them with others and reinforcing them if you need to as well.
Thank you, Aqua. That's such a beautiful way of both introducing something about you while really grounding us in how we can connect with you authentically through how we address you. So I appreciate you opening that way. In our conversation, preparing for why authentic leadership is such a important topic for folks in this network, we talked about this idea of imposter phenomenon as one of the reasons that we don't always feel like we are showing up as our authentic selves. Can you talk with us a little bit about where this imposter phenomenon comes from?
Yeah. And I will say, actually, my ideas and actually thoughts around imposter phenomenon have evolved even further. For many of you in here, you maybe have heard of imposter syndrome, and maybe even feel like that's something maybe you struggle with a bit. And I think the first thing I want to mention is sort of the power of words. And for me, this idea of a syndrome just seemed a bit too much. I really felt like calling it a syndrome in the first place was sort of kind of taking the power away from me. And I think one of the things that comes up as I think about, imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome is really recognizing the role we also play in it, but recognizing that there's also a lot of times this external component to it. So I'm getting off a bit, but also I just wanted to sort of share that I've evolved from calling it imposter syndrome to imposter phenomenon. And actually recently was in a conversation this week, where they actually referred to something they called imposter anxiety. And I actually think I want to call it now imposter anxiety because I think that better reflects what really pops up for some of us as we reflect on our relationship with being authentic and showing up as ourselves. And I think that's really important because I think it's normal and natural to have some level of imposter feelings or imposter anxiety as you try something new, as you're doing something different, as you're trying to figure out your boundaries or what your comfort zone is, and maybe even thinking about expanding it. Of course, there can be times where, it's more than just anxiety, right? It actually is something bigger than that. But for so many of us, I really do think it is just sort of a feeling that comes and goes based on the things that we're doing. And in different parts of our lives, we might have some of those feelings or anxieties, but in other parts, it might not show up at all. And so one, I think, reflecting on our relationship with imposter syndrome, phenomenon, or anxiety, I think is really important. The role we can play, but also recognizing that, especially as it relates to showing up as authentic in ourselves and trying to bring out more of ourselves, that the environment can also play a role as well. And I think that for some of us, we might be using the terms or the words imposter syndrome or phenomenon, but it's actually more of the environment that we're in. And so what role does that play in how we feel about ourselves as well, I think is also important to reflect on. And I think this brings us to another thing that we discussed in that conversation around, right? There definitely could be external components to it, and I think they're important to acknowledge. But what role can we play, and what are the stories we tell ourselves as well? And what do we decide to do as a result of those stories or some of the things maybe we become aware of as it relates to reflecting on imposter phenomenon or syndrome or anxiety, whichever you choose. So those are some of the initial thoughts that come up as it relates to thinking about that particular concept.
Yeah, and I'm going to speak louder. Apologies. My headphones died mid-conversation. So, Aqua, when we think about these stories, right, and I'm sensitive to the fact that there are truths about some of the externalities that may be working against some of us, especially women of color in leadership. How do we suss out the difference between when these are internal stories we're telling ourselves that we have some control over, when there might be some things out of our control, and then what can we do when we do, like for the things that are in our control, for the stories that we are telling ourselves, what can we do to kind of shift that narrative?
Yeah, sometimes it's kind of difficult actually to be able to even, sort of suss out or figure out what's internal or what's external sometimes. But I think it really does start with having a reflection practice and, taking the time to really reflect on how you're feeling, how you're showing up in different environments, and also maybe just even reflecting on when do those feelings of the syndrome or phenomenon or anxiety pop up. Just by starting by keeping track of that and having that information can help you start to recognize when it's potentially triggered or when it comes up for you. And after you start to do that, you might be able to dive even a little bit deeper if you recognize maybe it's an individual potentially, right, within your community or within an institution maybe you work with. Is it the sort of overall culture, right? So maybe it's more than one individual. It's how others potentially show up. But I definitely think it starts with being somewhat intentional and creating somewhat of a reflective practice to see where this maybe pops up. And I think working with a coach is a really great way potentially to help hold you accountable to do that. And also, of course, working with a coach can also help you break that down potentially as well. But as I reflect on some of, the things that pop up for me in relation to, experiencing this phenomenon or having this anxiety, I think that building my own practices and routines or rituals around reinforcing my own self-belief has been incredibly important. So there's some really, really interesting research out there. And this is one of the things that we talked about as we were preparing for this conversation. And, there's some really interesting research that initially started in education around what your teacher thought of you and your abilities would have an impact on your ability to actually perform. So if your teacher told you were good students, I'm really summarizing this right now, really reducing it. But ultimately, if your teacher told you were a good student, you were more likely to have better outcomes, right? And we also have seen that actually play out in some interesting research in the workplace as well. So external people's perception of you and sharing that perception with you can have an impact on how you show up, right? And so that's why keeping track of it, right, and where this might come from or when it's triggered can be really helpful. And there's also some really interesting research on sort of this self-belief as well. And so if you believe you can do it, right, you're also more likely potentially to be able to tackle that big challenge or head towards that big goal as well. And so as I think about that second piece, that self-belief, I think that can be built by building habits and routines and rituals where you're reminding yourself of some of the things you've been able to overcome and maybe how you've worked through some things in the past. For me, a really big thing since starting to work for myself is sort of reminding myself of some of the small wins, because sometimes as a solopreneur, you only really focus on the negative things and what didn't go well. And so cultivating a really intentional habit around, hey, like this went well. Hey, this worked has been really helpful to help to balance out our natural tendency to focus on the negative. And so I think it's, sometimes through asking for help, right? So that could be through a coach, working with a therapist. But you can also, I think, build some of your own habits and routines to also help to work through some of that completely normal and natural imposter anxiety or feelings that will pop up. And they should pop up, right? I think that being potentially, having imposter anxiety in certain situations, I think that potentially is a good sign, a sign that maybe you want something to go well and you want to do a good job. And the question is, how do you process that and move forward through that time and time again?
I really appreciate, as you were speaking, it was reminding me that sometimes even the expectations of others, they are speaking good things into our lives. But it creates this, something we use in my solopreneur circle is this idea. We say, I have the FUDs, which are fears, uncertainties, and doubts. That's our way of not saying we're an imposter, but this idea that someone's expecting something. Sometimes it's myself, but sometimes, others are expecting something of me, and I have fear, uncertainty, and doubt of being able to fulfill that expectation. And something, Aqua, you mentioned when we were talking, that they also talk about some of those stories and that imposter phenomenon happening more often with high achieving women. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So a few months ago, I was asked to do a podcast interview on imposter syndrome. And I said, I don't think it's a syndrome. I don't like that word. And there's been some really interesting articles that actually come out that said things along the lines of, don't tell women of color they're like, struggling with imposter, syndrome. Like there's more external things related to it. But I simply just share that because as I was doing more research on where this term or this concept of imposter syndrome came from, I learned that some of the initial research was actually done on white high achieving women. So the key piece of it was that it initially was called imposter phenomenon. And then sort of as it became somewhat more mainstream and some of this research made its way into everyday people, it ended up sort of being shifted to imposter syndrome. And so I also think it is important for us to sort of better understand where some of these terms, some of these concepts come from. But the idea is that in order to even have imposter phenomenon, you do already have to be high achieving, right? It can't be applied to someone, or technically shouldn't be applied to someone who isn't already doing like amazing things and is incredible. So that's sort of another piece to it as well. And I think it's quite interesting. And I think it's always very important to be able to, label things or put words to things, because I think that allows us to process things. But I also think it's important sometimes to understand where these words come from and where these concepts come from, because they can't be applied to every situation. And so once again, there's a really interesting article. I think it's from Harvard Review, if I remember correctly, around like this idea of imposter syndrome has been used in instances where it's like, no, it's actually the institution. It's the organization. It's the company that's actually the problem. It's actually this external thing that's then creating women feeling like, then it's sort of causing women to feel like they have something wrong with them, right? And sort of labeling them as having imposter syndrome. And I think that is definitely not a positive or constructive thing. And I think something that we all have to reflect on as we use these words as well.
So you spoke a little bit about the importance of self-reflection in building up like your self-belief. And I see others in the chat kind of appreciating this idea that, you're even reframing that the idea of having imposter anxiety or syndrome can't be a positive thing. It means you care. It means you're high achieving. Can you share a little bit about when you're practicing this, the reflection and building up your self-belief? You shared with me a little bit around just this idea of self-compassion and that the stories we tell ourselves to get to this point may need to even change to take us into that gap, that like we are in a position to lead because we are high achieving, and now we're being asked to do something that maybe we have fears, uncertainties, and doubts because we are asked to do something we've never done before, but people believe we're capable of. So what's that self-compassion look like? What's it look like to build new stories about who we are and what we're capable of?
Yeah. Definitely starts with that self-reflection piece, right? So that self-awareness piece. And I mentioned earlier, like understanding potentially what's triggering, what's coming up for you. Is it something external? What are the stories that are coming up for you? What are you telling yourself as potentially you're triggered? Is it around specific people in specific environments? Having that, information, some of that data, I think can be very helpful. I then think it then sort of the next sort of step, or the next thing maybe to potentially reflect on after you're aware a little bit more of what those stories are, is potentially to potentially ask for help, right? It could be, once again, working with a coach, working with a therapist, if it, makes sense in that case. It could be maybe even asking for training as well within an organization. If you're moving up, but you feel like you need to build your capacity in something specific. So for example, you might have some of this anxiety because maybe you weren't actually given the training or given the opportunity to build specific skills that allow you to be successful in that environment, right? So it could be around that, sort of advocating for yourself, asking for help in that particular way. And then that last piece around self-compassion. And one of the reasons why I think about it in this way is simply because when I reflect on my own leadership journey, a huge piece of being able to sort of step up to the next level and move into this position that I was given in the past was almost around, grieving what I was doing previously, right? And so that's where that self-compassion piece comes in, because for some of us to get to this next step or this next level, we might actually have to shed or let go of what got us there. So for me specifically, to make it a little bit more tangible, my first leadership position was launching and running an online platform. Prior to that, I was pretty much an individual contributor. I wasn't really managing other people, but in order to be successful, I had to sort of let go of doing it all on my own, which is something I took pride in. I was an executor. I could get things done. I'd get them done in my way. But that was something I had to sort of let go of, right? And I do think I went through, whether or not I was aware of it at the time, a grieving period of like, but that was me back then, right? But who is me now, right? And where do I want to get to? And so sometimes it is about having an intentional period where we say, well, those were some good times, but I really want to get to this point. And so because of that, I maybe need to let go of something. For other people, practicing self-compassion might be around once you become aware of some of these stories you tell yourself, and if they're not very constructive, or you find yourself maybe beating yourself up for not doing things in a particular way, it's about becoming aware of what you're telling yourself and asking yourself, is there maybe a more compassionate, more constructive way you can look at it? So maybe reframing it, using that as a tool, or another story you could potentially tell yourself. So for example, you're in a leadership position and it's, maybe your first day, you do something wrong, and maybe you think to yourself, oh, you're such an idiot. Rather than that, maybe it's something along the lines of, that maybe didn't go my way, but, tomorrow's another day and I have a different approach that I can maybe apply, right? That's kind of a long one, but, practicing sort of self-compassion. What would you tell your best friend if that situation happened to them, right? I think that's always sort of a great way to help you reframe how you potentially are talking to yourself, or talking through or processing a situation that maybe you have some anxiety over, or there's maybe a gap between how you were hoping you would show up and how you actually showed up.
I smiled because I'm actually in Tulsa with a friend who, when I'm talking negatively about my own self, she says, "Can you please not talk about my best friend that way?"
I love that. I love it.
Yeah, it's a helpful reminder that if we can treat ourselves as our best friend, we would probably talk to ourselves a little bit differently. You're making me wonder about this evolution of ourselves and how we still find our authentic leadership. It's, as you were describing that kind of grief about the leader we were and the leader we're becoming, I imagine those are instances where we also struggle around showing up authentically because we ourselves are kind of going through a bit of a identity evolution. Have you, as you're coaching folks, as you're experiencing it yourself, Aqua, do you have thoughts on how we kind of remain grounded and what parts of ourselves, you have a great intro that can be done no matter where you are in leadership and how you're leading. Are there other aspects of identifying those parts of our own leadership that we carry with us versus what maybe it's okay to shed?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I think it's going to depend. I think it's really going to be like everyone's individual journey. Because even as I reflect on that introduction I gave, that's something that I decided I wanted to do and that I was willing to do because of what I've chosen to do for my work. There was a time where I actually get really mad at people when they would ask me, a lot of times I'd go into calls and people would just be like, but where are you from? I don't understand. Tell me how you got this accent. And so I felt the most authentic way, the most Ikria or the most Akua. I call myself Cuckoo, so I have a lot of nicknames as well. So in my head, I'm Cuckoo. I call myself Cuckoo. I was like, Cuckoo or Kooks, you're like, how would you deal with this? What is the most Cuckoo way to deal with something that comes up for people naturally? And I think it's normal and natural to be curious, but how can I sort of potentially almost combat this? And I was like, I could do a fun little introduction that is mine, where I'm not being forced to justify myself or explain myself. Because some people really, they get attitudes about it. They're like, you cannot, this is not real. And I'm like, no, this is me. I'm real. And so that's sort of my authentic way of sort of showing up and being myself. And I think putting myself in my best foot forward. A few years ago, I probably wouldn't have shown up in that way. So that is sort of my own evolution, dealing with something that sort of just comes up as I move into different spaces and do different types of work around the world. So I think it very much is an individual journey, involves a lot of trial and error, right? And there's nothing wrong with trying something on or putting yourself out there and then deciding, nope, that's not for me, right? I saw someone in the chat, I think, post something about like LinkedIn and sort of how LinkedIn maybe brings up some anxiety for them. I also have a very like complicated relationship with LinkedIn as well. I've tried many things, and there's many things I've done on that platform I will never do again. But I do think that everyone owes it to themselves to at least potentially try. And then, of course, you can decide, reflect on it, and, you know, maybe it ends up, this very much doesn't align with my values, and I'm not willing to stretch there. But I think it's really through trial and error. For some of us, it's also maybe through seeing what other people do and asking ourselves, like, ooh, how could I apply that? What would that look like for me? And sort of going at it from a very curious sort of perspective, but very much, I think, trial and error.
Amazing. I know we are coming up on, we want to do some interaction with the audience, but I do just want to see, Aqua, if there's anything I haven't asked you that you kind of want to leave this group with before they start to reflect on some of their own experiences.
Oh, I would say the first thing is that like we're all evolving and we're constantly evolving. And I think for me, that was something that was really difficult to wrap my head around at one point. But I think that that's what we do as human beings. We evolve, things will change. And I really like actually what someone put in the chat at some point, this idea of the wins, right? And no matter how small it is, that we should celebrate the win. And I think that as we evolve, if we celebrate our wins, keep track of it in whatever way makes sense for us, it's going to be a lot easier for us to show up authentically, because being able to be authentic, I think, also means that you probably have pretty good boundaries because you're aware of where I am right now. I'm willing to accept that or I'm not. And so I think that it's a lot easier for us to also advocate for ourselves as well. If we take the time, right, and give ourselves space to reflect, ask for help, you know, practice self-compassion, I think it's a lot easier for us to make sure we're asking for what we need as well, or saying no to things that we know just won't vibe.
Yeah, thank you. I love that. It reminds me of the 1 year I did of psychology, where the negativity bias, to overcome one negative, story or experience, you need 7 positives. So just imagine, our own negativity bias towards ourselves, and the importance of celebrating 7 wins to just combat one, critique of ourselves. So I agree. I love and echo what you've and our other participants have said about remembering to celebrate our wins. So I know we want to give you all a chance to get into some small group breakouts and reflect on a question together. Amber, do you want to share that question with the group? And I think we're going to give you 7 minutes in breakout. So please come back to us. We want to continue the conversation together and think if there are any questions that you have, we'll have a chance to ask. You will have a chance to ask Aqua your questions. So Amber says, she put it in the chat, but it is, when was a time that you were able to reframe a story about yourself that allowed you to show up more authentically as a leader?
Yeah, it was interesting when I first read the question. There wasn't a story that immediately came to mind, but I just realized I'm for 7 years I've been a fundraiser. I come from a program background, and I have felt imposter syndrome being a fundraiser because this isn't something that I'm used to. But just sharing my story with the group, I realized that I am an authentic leader because I have shared my upbringing with donors, high net worth donors, which are often disconnected from where I grew up. I grew up in a low income family in Bombay, India, immigrated here. I've had a very different journey than a lot of the donors, but I've just leaned into that, and leaning into that has helped me become a more effective fundraiser, because I think that authenticity helps people connect with our work and, with the Asia Foundation's work. So, I I shouldn't doubt myself anymore. Like I should just lean in and like be authentic and just like go hard, and go forward, with it, with the power that I am here for a reason. And my whole journey is connected to the point that I'm at right now.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Nikita. Rana?
Hi everyone. I was talking in my group, and it sort of dawned on me that there's two ways to look at this. One is when for you to step up and overcome whatever we're calling that feeling that you have, that no matter how good you actually are, you're not that good. It comes either from you or it comes from your surroundings. So a lot of times it's not just you doubting yourself. Even when you don't doubt yourself, sometimes there are certain people that you come across in your work and the kind of work you do, where it's very competitive. And there is that tendency to try and outshine you. So if you're not already that confident of a person, it just triggers those, I knew I wasn't good enough. I knew I shouldn't have taken this. I knew I shouldn't have done this. I'm sure they know so much more than I do. I probably look like such a fool. And for me, I've been working for so long, and in every, job, I really tried to show up, and I overcame that. And I was like, I can do this. I can do this. So I went from being a project assistant to an officer to a team lead. And it was so hard to get to a position when I finally became like a deputy leader. And I was like, okay, this is it. This is my limit. Thank God I got this, And then suddenly the organization I'm working with now, they had a job opening, and I was like, I'll apply for the same position. And they sort of came back to me and said, you know what, we want you for a higher position. I was like, no. And this is the first time this has ever happened to me. So they were like, no, we'd like you for chief of party. And I was like, are you crazy? And the lady was talking, and she's like, no, you can do it. And I was like, no. And this is like, I should be saying, of course I can do it. And my daughters were telling me, Mommy, fake it till you make it. Fake it till you make it. And I was like, no. I was so overwhelmed. It took such a long time for them to convince me that, why can't you? We know you can do it. And I was like, I know more than you. You don't even know me. You guys are new. You don't even know me. Like, this is a call. But they supported me so much, and it took such a long time for me to actually be comfortable and say, you know what? Yeah, of course, I can do this. And then I was able to step up to that and say, okay, remove that, and start stepping up, read, ask for support. Look at the people around you who are saying, come on, you can do this. Let's do it. And now I am happy, but I still have those doubts every now and then. It's like, am I really cut out for this? Am I doing a good job? Am I not? Am I just faking it till I make it, as my kids say, So I just wanted to share that with you.
Wow, Rana. Thank you. That is a very relatable and inspiring story. It reminds me of how, what do they say, men will apply for a job with like 50% of the qualifications, and women wait until they have like 80 to 100%. So
100%. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Tasha?
Hello and great morning, everyone. I joined right when we went into breakout rooms, but I did get a chance to hear the question, and Rana was actually in my group, so I'm inspired to kind of share. One thing that definitely came up for me during the call is that, I've had times, first of all, I come from an untraditional background. So, I've like made my way through nonprofit, tech, and like social impact, but I don't have a academic degree right now. But I've always earned certifications and things like that. And I feel like that in itself, coming into the workplace, has made me really second guess myself a lot. And then I've dealt with that. But one thing I'm learning to do is just sit with what I know, like really attempt to bring the best that I can and the best that I do know in that moment. And then allow for questions, allow for other people to discover what they need to know, and not take on the feeling of like, I'm not enough, I'm not providing enough, when I know I've done the pre-work. I think that's when I feel the most confidence. So when I came on at the bare end, when our host was sharing about how we need to reflect and, ask those questions and like take time to really reflect, I think that resonated with me, because when I take time to reflect, when I take time to do the work on the back end, I show up so confidently. And I'm able to sit in my own self. I'm able to sit in my person and know that like I've provided value. I've like brought like, my best to this. And now if anyone else is confused about anything, if anyone else, because one of the things that would trip me up is I would over explain myself a lot, because I felt like people didn't understand me. Or maybe in the past I've had people that, needed more explanation, and that kind of became like in my subconscious. And now I'm like, okay, what can I do to bring my full self and everything that's needed to this conversation as a leader? And then also allow people to process on their own and not take it personal and make it feel like, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm not able to show up. So, I appreciate the biggest takeaway for me was like, oh man, there's other women that feel like me or that has experienced this. So I really enjoy being a part of this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Who else relates to feeling like if someone has a question, I didn't explain it well enough, so next time I'm going to like tell you all the things way more times than I need to? I definitely do that. Anyone else feel like sharing their own experience or have a question? Oh, Aqua, I see you're off mute.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's just really inspiring to hear everyone's stories and sort of hear what everyone's sort of thinking, what's coming up for them. One sort of theme that I'm hearing is sort of taking time to reflect on your journey, right? And reminding yourself of your journey can be such a powerful way to empower yourself, move yourself forward, and also advocate for yourself. And so as you think about building routines, right, journaling or even writing down your wins, that, right, can help capture the journey so that when you do have a time maybe when you're triggered, you can pull that up and potentially use that to help you continue to move forward. But I did want to share because I did get something in a direct message, so I'm going to read it out and would love to actually hear from all of you or any of you before maybe I share my perspective. But the message includes, can you share how you might handle a situation when you're in a group and you see the ways in which someone is not qualified to be in the leadership role, and it's really hard to be in the work environment because of their capabilities, but you don't want to dim their light, but it's just hard to be in the group. You love your job and you don't want to leave, right? So sort of a situation where, you don't want to, I guess, sort of, push somebody necessarily out, but at the same time, right, it's maybe not creating, I guess, from my perspective, maybe they're not able to create that psychological safety. Maybe they don't have the actual skills potentially, and it's maybe leaving or leading to a difficult situation. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts or anything come up for them. Offer feedback privately, right? Nikita, that's a great one. So potentially that, maybe offering them feedback privately. Anyone else? I mean, the first thing that comes up for me in relation to this particular question is sort of the organization. Like, within that organization, what are the types of people that are promoted that get opportunities? And is that the type of organization potentially you want to be in, knowing that these are the types of people that are promoted? I know saying that is maybe a very privileged thing to say because not everyone can necessarily hop from job to job very quickly or very easily. And if you do enjoy what you're doing, but the people around it sort of make it difficult or maybe are very draining, I think that potentially is a question maybe you can maybe ask yourself. But I think, offering feedback privately, if that's something that you can do, model the behavior you want to see in them. Those are potentially things that you can maybe consider. But for me, the first thing a lot of times think about when those types of things happen or people share it is sort of what's that system that you're in and really just recognizing that. If that's the type of person who's promoted, then, there might be a lot more those types of people that continue to be promoted as well. And so is that a place you want to be? I see Pooja has her hand up. Please go ahead.
Uh, yeah, I had this exact same experience with my last organization. I was working in a team earlier, then got under some other director, and I realized that the new director had a very different way of working, which doesn't align with my personal thing. And he always try to put me down because I believe in working very hard for my job, get the work done. And he was very different. Like he want people to kind of pamper him and all. So I was in a very frustrated position for a very long time. But then I realized this thing that if one, I tried talking to him one on one, have these conversations to get a better perspective so that because I just was thinking that it might be just maybe I'm thinking that way. But when he kind of like hold my appraisal because of my maternity, that time I realized that no, this is not my fault and I cannot take it further. So the thing that I did was I started working on my skill building. I started learning new skills, new things, so that over time I can slowly move to a different department or a better company. Eventually, I end up like leaving that whole profile and I entered a even better world of sustainability compared to like the one which I was earlier. But this is a kind of a slow process. It needs to take some time, and we need to kind of like keep building our skill set so that we become more competent for better roles than we are already in. So that was my approach. I think there can be few others also.
Thank you, Pooja. Very wise long-term plan if the immediate option to change is not available. I want to first thank Aqua for sharing some wisdom and all of you for contributing before I turn it back over to Athena to close us out for this session. So thank you all for your engagement and for your vulnerability in sharing with us today.
Yeah, and thank you, Whitney and Aqua. That was such a great conversation. I feel like we could go a lot further with that. And thinking of that, what I'd love for everybody on the call to do is if there is a topic that you would like to see in a future Empower Hour session, please put it in the chat because this is our first one. This was really a clear one for us because of all the feedback that we've gotten. And there's some others we have in mind, but we'd love to hear from you. What would you like to hear about from one of our coaches or a combination of one of our catalysts and coaches? Because we're going to do, different formats here. So if there's a topic you want, please put it in the chat. We'd love to hear that. And many of you are already a part of our community. We have some coaches here today. Thank you, amazing WIA volunteer coaches who make everything we do possible. Thank you all. And we also have women who are currently in the program, who have graduated from the program. And I think we may have some who have not participated in the program yet. And I want to invite all of you, I'm going to put it in the chat now, to check out the program that we have, that at the core of it is coaching and these kinds of conversations that we had today. So I'd love to see more people join the community. Keep an eye open for the recording of this. We're going to do it. It's going to be an audio recording, so you can listen to it in your, in your car, in your commute, whatever, if you want to hear it again. And also, just look out for the next Empower Hour, which we anticipate will be in a couple of months, and maybe one of the topics that you're bringing up right now. So thank you all so much. If you have a moment, put one thing in the chat that you are walking away with today. One thing. I know mine is imposter anxiety. I really love that reframing. So anything that you want to share that you got out of the chat, if you want to thank Aqua and Whitney, send them some love. Yeah. Great. Here's some really, really good topics coming up. Community building, negotiation, advocating for yourself. Awesome. Self-compassion. Someone got out of it. Managing energy and time. Absolutely. Wonderful. All right, everyone. Well, I'm going to wish you a good rest of your day or evening, whatever time zone you are in. And we really look forward to seeing you next time at the next Empower Hour.